Bonsoir, bienvenue au webinaire de ce soir, Réimaginer le potentiel de l'alimentation pour chats, gérer les allergènes du chat, qui présentera les récentes innovations dans le domaine de la gestion de cette allergie. Le webinaire sera en 4 parties. On commencera avec la présentation du professeur docteur médecin Peter Schmidt-Grendelmeyer. C'est un allergologue et dermatologue certifié, chef d'une unité d'allergologie au département de dermatologie de l'hôpital universitaire de Zurich depuis 2003. Il possède une longue expérience des soins cliniques aux patients, ayant travaillé en Suisse, mais aussi dans les régions tropicales, notamment en Tanzanie. Il a également une longue expérience dans la recherche translationnelle qui œuvre à transformer les découvertes scientifiques en traitements médicaux et dans la formation du personnel médical et paramédical. Il présentera la première partie, l'allergie au chat, une cause fréquente d'allergie respiratoire chez l'homme. Pour cette partie, le Dr Grendelmeyer n'a malheureusement pas pu être présent ce soir, mais si vous avez des questions à son intention, nous les lui transférons volontiers et vous répondrons par email. Pour la deuxième partie, nous entendrons le Dr Andy Sparks, PhD, diplômé de l'European College of Veterinary Internal Medicine, membre de l'Australian and New Zealand College of Veterinary Scientists et du Royal College Veterinary Surgeon. Dr Sparks est un consultant indépendant spécialisé dans la médecine féline. Sa présentation explore d'abord le pouvoir du lien humain-animal en présentant des données fascinantes sur les avantages de la compagnie des animaux pour la santé physique et mentale. Puis il nous parlera de l'incidence de l'allergie au chat sur le bien-être des félins et sur leur relation avec les humains. Cette partie sera suivie d'un exposé du Dr Ebenezer Satyaraj, PhD en immunologie, donc immunologiste et nutritionniste moléculaire, dont les travaux au centre de recherche Nestlé de Purina ont jeté les bases sur la récente percée dans la gestion des allergènes félins. Une problématique qui lui tient à cœur, étant donné que sa propre fille est elle-même allergique aux poils de chat. Le Dr Satyaraj présentera les bases biologiques de l'allergie au chat, le principal allergène du chat, FLD1, et l'approche novatrice de Purina qui consiste à neutraliser cet allergène à l'aide d'anticorps anti-FLD1, aidant ainsi les propriétaires à réduire simplement et en toute sécurité leur exposition à l'allergène. Pour terminer, nous aurons une présentation de l'innovation Liveclear présentée par le Dr Medved Claudia Vischer, responsable de l'innovation scientifique chez Nestlé Purina PetCare Europe, Moyen-Orient et Afrique du Nord, et responsable du projet qui a permis d'introduire cette innovation nutritionnelle en Europe, l'approche alimentaire pour lutter contre les allergènes des chats. À la fin, il y aura un petit moment pour les questions aussi. Les présentations seront soit en français, soit en anglais sous-titré français. Et afin que le webinaire se passe au mieux, nous avons encore 2-3 petites recommandations. Merci de bien désactiver votre micro pendant les présentations. Pour poser les questions, vous pourrez les poser en anglais ou en français directement au fur et à mesure dans la fonction chat. Et à la fin de la présentation, les questions seront lues et répondues par les intervenants. Et nous vous informons également que le webinaire de ce soir sera enregistré. Sans plus attendre, place aux présentations. Bon webinaire.
Bonjour messieurs et dames, c'est un grand plaisir pour moi de vous présenter quelques aspects de l'allergie au chat. Moi je suis Peter Schmidt-Grendelmeyer, je travaille et je suis le chef de l'unité d'allergologie à l'hôpital universitaire de Zurich. Les allergies, c'est des maladies très fréquentes. C'est un quart de notre population qui souffre des allergies inhalatives ou sur des allergènes qui viennent de l'air. Mais ce qui est aussi très fréquent, c'est les allergies aux aliments. En plus, on traite les allergies aux médicaments et aux hyménoptères, l'abeille, les vèpes. Mais on ne va pas parler de ça. Les allergies sur les voies respiratoires et aussi les yeux, la plus fréquente cause, c'est les pollens, du bouleau, des graminées, mais aussi des petits animaux, des acariens et des animaux, les mammifères, surtout le chat, le chien, le cheval, de temps en temps aussi des oiseaux, et très rarement des champignons. On loupe facilement les champignons, mais ils sont quand même assez importants. Les animaux, de les garder, c'est très important. Vous voyez ici, pet love et endless love. Il y a des champs pour lesquels ces animaux sont très importants. C'est des familles, c'est des personnes âgées, mais c'est aussi des enfants. Ils vraiment aiment son chat, son chien. C'est à comprendre qu'on a une relation très spéciale. C'est pour ça que aussi les allergies aux animaux, c'est très fréquent. Il y a même des livres comme ce livre que vous voyez ici, Allergic to Pets, Breakthrough Guide to Living with the Animals You Love. Alors, ça nous aide à vivre avec les allergies. Et c'est sûrement un grand potentiel
Faut faire respirer tout seul.
de traiter ces allergies, parce que c'est l'allergie respiratoire qui est le plus dérangeant, ce qui est a le poids le plus lourd pour les. On ne croit pas que les gens possèdent comme animaux, comme le raccoon que vous voyez ici, le léguan et d'autres animaux. On a rencontré tous, soit que c'est des mammifères ou des reptiles ou la nourriture des reptiles, des oiseaux. Alors pour ça, les gens ont beaucoup d'idées. Les rats, par exemple, se sont devenus très, très à la mode avec quelques pellicules comme où les rats ont joué un rôle très sympa. C'est pour ça qu'on rencontre ça de plus en plus aussi comme animal à la maison. Si vous faites le diagnostic d'une allergie aux animaux, et normalement les gens ils n'aiment pas du tout et ils préfèrent plutôt de changer le médecin qui leur fait cette diagnostic. Alors, si vous voulez faire disons que vous n'êtes pas très bien respecté ou qu'on ne vous aime pas comme médecin, il faut dire aux gens qui sont allergiques à son chat, à son cheval, à son lapin. Pour le diagnostic, on est très fortement basé sur l'histoire clinique. L'anamnèse est très important. En plus, on a les tests cutanés, les tests au laboratoire. Et si on n'avance pas avec ça, on fait les tests co. Le test cutané, c'est le skin prick test qui est très simple à faire et qui vous aide de faire un diagnostic immédiat. En 15 minutes, vous voyez, avec les urticaires ici, si on a une urtique qui vient après 10-15 minutes, pour un allergène qui est dans cette solution, c'est une réponse très vite. Mais c'est là son. En plus, on a les tests sérologiques au laboratoire. Exemple, après les. Ici, vous voyez, on mesure les IgE dans le sérum, dans le sang, qui mesure, par exemple, les IgE contre le boulot, mais de plus en plus, on mesure aussi les IgE contre les allergènes moléculaires, c'est-à-dire le protéine soi-même qui cause l'allergie. Ici, c'est le PETVE, ça vient du nom Pectula verrucosa, et on peut mesurer ça de plus en plus. Ça nous aide beaucoup à comprendre les allergies chroniques. Ce qui est bien important de différencier entre une sensibilisation, c'est-à-dire on voit des IgE soit dans le sang ou on voit un test positif, et une allergie, si on a vraiment des symptômes de ça. C'est-à-dire si vous avez un prick test ou un IgE contre les graminées, mais pas de symptômes pendant la période où on a les graminées dans l'air, c'est juste qu'une sensibilisation. Mais une allergie aux graminées, si c'est les gens vraiment la conjonctivite, la rhinite, l'asthme pendant la saison des graminées. Alors, c'est pas la même chose. Sensibilisation, c'est juste la preuve d'IgE. Allergie, c'est vraiment la démonstration des symptômes cliniques avec ces sensibilisations. Et comme je vous ai dit, de plus en plus, on voit ça sur un niveau moléculaire, c'est-à-dire on voit les plusieurs composants, on peut les mesurer avec des tests très sensitifs. On appelle ça aussi l'allergie basée sur les composants. Et avec les animaux, on fait aussi des progrès avec. Là, vous avez un exemple, comme le maître et son chien. On comprend plus en plus mieux les allergies aux animaux avec des poils, c'est les mammifères. Et ça, c'est un article que je peux vous recommander qui comprennent beaucoup d'allergies sur le chat, le chien, la vache, le cheval, le rat. Et de plus en plus, on voit aussi chez ces animaux, les allergies moléculaires. L'allergène majeur chez le chat, c'est FeLD1, Felis domesticus 1, si vous voulez. Mais on a aussi d'autres allergènes qui sont par exemple l'hypocaline, le FeLD3, ce qui rencontre aussi avec le chien. Et ça nous permet aussi de différencier ces patients qui sont juste allergiques au chat, ils ont juste une sensibilisation contre FeLD1. Si vous avez une sensibilisation contre l'hypocaline, normalement, ces patients ils réagissent au chat, au chien et à tous les autres animaux habités. Et on comprend de plus en plus mieux ce spectre des allergènes. Et vous voyez ici, pour le chat, on a déjà 8 allergènes, chez le chien 5, et ça augmente le cobaye, le rat, le souris. On comprend mieux en mieux ces allergies au niveau moléculaire. Pour le chat, on a la sensibilisation au FeLD1, qui est le plus important, aussi FeLD4. Ça fait des symptômes de rhinite, conjonctivite, d'asthme, c'est-à-dire des allergies vraiment respiratoires. Mais on a aussi d'autres allergènes, comme le FeLD2. Ça, c'est plutôt quelque chose si on a du contact avec, si vous voulez, la viande. Et en plus, on a des allergènes qui se trouvent dans d'autres sources. Je reviens à ça. Pendant le FeLD1, c'est très important pour 95-98% des allergies aléatoires au chat, c'est-à-dire allergie au chat. Normalement, c'est aussi une allergie contre le FeLD1. Le FeLD1, ça se trouve le plus dans les chats masculins, moins dans les chats féminins et le moins dans les chats masculins qui ont eu une castration, c'est-à-dire qui ne sont plus des chats masculins. Alors aussi, le FeLD1, ça se baisse. Le FeLD1 se trouve dans la salive, dans les glandes salivaires. Alors, si le chat, avec son tongue et son salive, se nettoie, il y a aussi d'allergènes sur le poil. Et comme ça peut se distribuer dans un appartement, partout. C'est un allergène très léger, alors ça reste longtemps dans l'air, et c'est un allergène très collant. C'est-à-dire ça, une fois que ça se met sur un lit, sur un tapis ou quelque chose, ça reste pour des semaines ou même des mois. Même après 2 ans, on peut constater s'il y avait un chat dans un appartement, s'il n'y a pas, par exemple, des tapis dans cet appartement. C'est-à-dire que c'est un allergène assez pénétrant et assez agressif, si vous voulez, comme c'est léger. Je reviens encore aux allergies croisées. Il y a un allergène, le FeLD5, qui se trouve dans d'autres sources comme la viande et même dans des médicaments. Ça, c'est des patients qui réagissent allergiquement à la viande rouge, si vous voulez, de la vache, de l'agneau, du porc. Et c'est aussi une allergie. Normalement, ces allergies, ça est basé sur une pointe d'une tique. Ça, je ne sais pas, un algas qui prend du sang et il injecte avec sa salive cette protéine qui s'appelle galactose 1, 2, 3 alpha-galactose ou brièvement alpha-gal. Et ça c'est très semblable au fel des seins du chat. Et c'est très semblable à une allergène dans la viande. Et c'est pour ça qu'on a des allergies croisées aux chats, aux allergies contre le cetuximab, le Erbitux, qui est un médicament contre le cancer ovarien. Alors c'est une allergie assez fascinante, si vous voulez. On trouve les allergènes du chat dans la salive, mais aussi dans l'urine et aussi sur le poil. C'est pour ça que c'est partout, mais la salive, c'est le plus. On peut avoir un contact par inhalation, avec le contact direct, ou avec l'environnement. Si vous avez des vêtements ou un tapis où il y avait le chat, on peut avoir le contact. Si vous êtes mordu par un chat, on peut avoir des allergies. Et si jamais vous mangerez un chat, avec la viande, on a aussi un contact avec l'allergène. Ce n'est pas très fréquent chez nous, mais vous savez bien qu'il y a des cultures. On mange aussi les chats, les chiens. On peut couper l'allergie majeure, j'ai déjà expliqué. C'est cette allergène qui joue un rôle au moins avec la moitié, une cinquantaine de. Et encore une fois, on comprend de plus en plus l'allergie avec des allergènes majeures qui sont nommées ici. Pour le chat, c'est sûrement le FLD1. Et les autres allergènes qui sont beaucoup moins importants, soit qu'ils sont additionnels ou que dans des cas très rares, c'est vraiment la cause. Ici, vous voyez les allergènes. L'utéroglobine, c'est le FLD1. Les autres ont une structure différente. De plus en plus, on voit aussi et c'est l'hypocaline, on connaît aussi de plus en plus bien. Ça, c'est les allergènes qu'on trouve chez tous les. Il y a aussi des gens qui travaillent avec des animaux et on a même des allergies occupationnelles, professionnelles qui sont dues à ces allergies. Surtout, c'est les souris et le rat pour des expériments avec les animaux. Mais il y a aussi les vétérinaires, on connaît bien, qui deviennent allergiques aux cobayes ou aux chats, chiens qui peuvent faire des problèmes sérieux si on travaille sur cette. C'est une autre, c'est souvent aussi les endotoxines, qu'on a vu ça, qui peut faire des allergies respiratoires. Et chez les paysans, c'est les vaches qui sont très importantes, surtout en Scandinavie. C'est l'allergène le plus important professionnel, une allergie aux vaches chez les farmers, par exemple en Finlande. L'allergène, si on veut l'éviter, c'est clair, il faut avoir pas de matériel textile comme le tapis, les meubles où il y a l'allergène peut se collectionner. On peut utiliser les aspirateurs qui ont des filtres comme le HEPA filtre qui extractent l'allergène et on pouvait même baigner le chat. Le chat, il ne va pas aimer ça, mais comme ça, on diminue l'allergène qui est sur les poils. Et vraiment, ça fait une réduction du level des allergènes de 20 à 30%. Mais c'est, comme j'ai dit, les chats, ils n'aiment pas ça. C'est pour ça que c'est pas très près. Si on a le chat en dehors de l'appartement, c'est très utile. Ce qui est très important, si c'est possible que le chat ne peut pas entrer dans la salle à dormir. Si là, il n'y a pas d'allergène, c'est déjà très, très utile, mais c'est clair, c'est pas si facile de faire un chat, de prendre un chat à ce point qu'il respecte, qu'il ne peut pas entrer dans la salle à dormir. On peut baigner les bains, le rester. Il y a aussi pas mal de produits qui sont vendus, comme le hypoallergenic cat ou des chiens qui sont en moins d'allergènes. Chez les chiens, les chiens avec des frais poils, comme le Portuguese Water Dog ou le Poodle, ils ont vraiment moins d'allergènes parce qu'ils le perdent moins que ceux qui ont vraiment juste des cheveux, comme les autres chiens. Chez les chats, jusque maintenant, on n'a pas encore des chats hypoallergènes, mais je sais que le produit que Purina est en train d'investiguer, d'établir, là, c'est clair, c'est une approche de réduire l'allergène. On peut aussi utiliser les cleaners d'air. Ils sont très efficaces, ils ont plus beau marché qu'avant et ils ont une certaine efficacité, c'est-à-dire que ce n'est pas faux de recommander. En plus, on a une immunothérapie qui est très efficace contre le pollen, moins efficace contre les acariens, mais ça a amélioré. Contre les animaux, on n'a pas encore une immunothérapie très efficace. La plus efficace, c'est encore contre les hyménoptères, l'abeille, la crêpe. Là, on arrive presque à 100%. Chez les animaux, il faut faire parce qu'on peut offrir une immunothérapie si quelqu'un est vraiment très allergique. On l'offre si quelqu'un ne peut pas l'éviter pendant son travail. Et en plus, il y a des raisons sociaux très importantes, une liaison, des aspects qui sont vraiment très importants. Mais ce qu'il faut savoir, l'efficacité, elle est là, mais on a pas mal des effets secondaires qui sont dangereux. C'est-à-dire, un patient avec de l'asthme, par exemple, si on traite avec l'immunothérapie conventionnelle subcutanée, on a le risque qu'il fait un asthme. Pendant l'injection, on avait même un cas de décès, quelqu'un qui est mouru pendant une immunothérapie avec le chat. Alors, il faut vraiment balancer les effets positifs et les effets secondaires qu'on a vraiment. On a d'autres approches, pas encore pour les animaux, c'est l'immunothérapie avec sa paroi de la peau, épicutaneous immunothérapie, ou orale avec les cacahuètes, c'est efficace, mais juste chez les enfants. Pour cette approche, on n'a pas encore des études. Par contre, on a des études qui travaillent avec les vaccinations, le vaccine based on the virus-like particles. Martin Bachmann et son groupe, il a montré ça, que c'est très efficace pour les cacahuètes aussi. Et maintenant, ils sont aussi à ce point où il y a des premiers résultats avec une vaccination contre l'allergie de chat, mais on vaccine aussi les chats qu'ils produisent des anticorps contre le FLD1 et comme ça, on a moins de symptômes chez ceux qui gardent les chiens. C'est un peu un aspect que vous, avec pour une approche, cherchez aussi de réduire l'allergène chez les chats et comme ça, de profiter pour les patients qui sont allergiques. Je vous remercie de votre attention. Avec mon team de l'unité d'allergologie de Zurich, je suis tout à fait prêt de prendre vos questions par email et je vous souhaite une bonne continuation du meeting et beaucoup de succès avec votre projet. Merci beaucoup pour votre attention.
Merci beaucoup pour la présentation. Nous avons finalement pu voir que Dr Peter Schmidt a pu finalement joindre le meeting et donc pourra répondre à vos questions. N'hésitez pas toujours à poser les questions dans la fonction chat du meeting. On va passer à la deuxième partie de la présentation.
So I'd like to begin just by saying a big thank you to Purina and the Purina Institute for giving me the opportunity of sharing with you today. And we're going to be looking at the impact of cat allergies on the cat and in particular the human-animal bond, the human-cat bond. So what I want to do with this presentation is just very briefly to look at pet ownership and that human-animal bond and the importance of the human-animal bond, and then why people choose to own cats, why people end up relinquishing cats on occasions to rehoming organizations in particular, and sometimes why rehoming of cats from a shelter ends up going wrong. And as you'll see as we go through this, cat allergies have an important role to play in all of this. First of all, we know that for both cats and dogs, the vast majority of pet cats and dogs that are kept in homes are considered to be a member of the family. Well over 90% of owners would say that their dog or their cat is simply a member of their family. That human-animal bond is extremely strong. It's based on the fact that there is unconditional love and affection that we receive from our pets. They provide companionship, they provide emotional support. And interestingly, the graph on the right-hand side there, that was a paper that was published in 2008. And it showed that more owners are secure in their relationship with their pet than they are with their partner. And I think that does speak to this unconditional love, the unconditional affection that we receive from our pets, which all of us that own dogs or cats know and recognize. It's interesting that studies have looked at the quality of the human-animal bond and compared dog ownership and cat ownership. Sometimes there have been differences that have been found, sometimes not. This was a study that tried to examine differences between dog owners and cat owners in their relationship with their pet. And interesting, they really found that there wasn't any difference in the quality of that human-animal bond, the companionship, the fact that it is something to love, affection that underlies this, the feeling that we get of being needed, of being loved, of being trusted by our dog or cat, the pleasure that we get from this. They found that there was no real difference between dog owners and cat owners with this. The quality of that relationship, the importance of that relationship is just the same, whether it's a cat or a dog. The only real differences between dog owners and cat owners comes when you ask questions that are more species specific. So, for example, does owning your pet make you feel safe? Well, not surprisingly, for dog owners, that's more commonly a yes than for cat owners. For dog owners, more often the ownership results in increased exercise. But if you take out those species-specific things, there's no real difference in the quality of that relationship. And that relationship is extremely important. Not only does it provide that love and affection that we desire, but it results in measurable improvement in physical and mental health characteristics as well. There are many reports of pet ownership and cat ownership increasing social support, very much like having a parent or a brother or sister, increased social support, increased feelings of self-esteem, increased happiness, and reduced feelings of isolation, reduced depression. In fact, in many countries where this has been studied, there is a significant reduction associated with pet ownership in visits to a healthcare professional and reduction in overall use of medication. And very good evidence from meta-analysis of data that pet ownership can improve cardiovascular disease and reduce hypertension. So there are health benefits from this as well. So with all of those benefits, you wonder sometimes why people don't own dogs and cats. And there have been studies that have looked at this. Why have you never owned a pet? Well, this is a study from American Humane Society that was published in 2012. They looked at 500 people that had never owned a dog or never owned a cat. And they asked them why they had never owned a dog or cat. And these were the reasons. Not surprisingly, some owners or some potential owners simply don't like dogs or cats. Their lifestyle is one where it would be difficult to have a dog or cat. But you can see there the third most common reason for not owning a cat was because they were allergic to cats, much more common than dogs. So cat allergy prevents some people from owning a cat in the first place. That study also asked people who had previously owned a dog or a cat why they no longer own that pet. So again, this was looking at 500 former cat owners, 500 former dog owners, and asking them why they no longer own a dog or a cat. And again, you can see that there are different reasons, as you would expect. Sometimes because the owner travels, sometimes because of the expense of owning a dog or cat, sometimes because they simply don't have time to look after a dog or cat. But again, you'll notice the fourth category there, being allergic to the cat, accounted for 16% of those former owners not now having a cat. Again, much higher for cats than dog owners. Allergy to the cat preventing them getting another cat. So another way of evaluating this, evaluating the impact of cat allergies, is to look at reasons why people give up their cat to a shelter, why they surrender their pet to a shelter or a rehoming organization. And there have been a number of studies in different countries that have looked at this and looked at the reason. The first thing I would say, and this was highlighted by this particular study, this is a decision that most owners find extremely difficult to make. In this particular study, every owner that they interviewed and asked about it, they really struggled with this decision. Sometimes we think that for owners, it's an easy thing just to relinquish their pet to a rehoming organization. For most owners, that is not an easy decision. But you can see this was a study that combined both dogs and cats. The second most common reason for relinquishment was allergy, 18%. Didn't differentiate between the dogs and the cats in this particular study. So this was a study from Australia looking at cats that were relinquished to shelters, 33 different shelters across Australia, looking at nearly 50,000 different owners that relinquished cats. Variety of different reasons, as you would expect, for cats giving up their cats to these shelters, from inappropriate housing, number of animals that were in the house, financial reasons, behavioral problems. But in 3% of the cases, it was because of an allergy. The owner had developed an allergy to the cats, and that was the reason for relinquishing the cat to the shelter. This was another survey from Australia looking at shelters in 3 different regions. Quite a detailed study looking at 55 owners of cats and their reasons for giving up the cat. Again, having inappropriate housing was a common reason. Their circumstances had changed in the house, which meant they couldn't cope with the cat any longer, financial reasons. But as you can see, developing an allergy to the cats was responsible for 18% of those relinquishments. So really quite a high proportion. This was another big study from the UK this time, looking at over 6,000 cats that were relinquished to 11 rehoming centres, cats protection rehoming centres in the UK. Again, you can see variety of different reasons, change in circumstances, a litter of kittens that have been born that the owners weren't expecting and weren't wanting, and so they gave them up to the shelter, behavioral reasons. But again, owners developing an allergy to the cat was a cause in 8% of those cases of relinquishment. So a significant number of those owners had to give up the cat because they were allergic to the cat. And this is that study from the United States again, from the American Humane Association. They looked at 105 cats and 95 24 dogs that were relinquished to shelters, and they found that, in fact, development of a cat allergy in this study was the second most common reason for cats to be relinquished to a shelter. Again, a much higher rate with cats than with dogs. Only 2% of dogs surrendered because of development of allergy. Another large study from the States, 12 shelters, reasons for relinquishment of nearly 1,500 cats, 19% of them, development of an allergy, the owner or somebody in the house developing an allergy to the cat was the reason, 19%, third most common reason, again, much more common for cats than for dogs as a reason for relinquishment. So these give us an idea of the importance of cat allergy as a cause of needing to give up the cat from living in the household. Just very briefly as well, there are also some studies that have been done where cats have been rehomed from a shelter and then brought back to the shelter because that rehoming failed. Why did that fail? Well, this was a study from the UK. They looked at 166 cats that were returned to shelters after being rehomed. In 18% of those cases, the cat was returned because of an allergy of somebody in the house, allergy to the cat. This was a carefully conducted study in the United States. This was University of Florida, where they had a group of cats that were involved in biomedical research, lethal studies. These cats were adopted out after the end of the studies. So over 450 cats adopted out. And they did a follow-up survey to see how successful that had been. Got results back from 275 of those cats. And most of them, 93%, stayed in their homes completely successful. 18 of those cats were relinquished. And again, the top 3 reasons for relinquishment of those cats: behavioral problems because it didn't get on with another cat in the house, behavioral problem because of inappropriate elimination, and in 17%, someone in the house was allergic to the cat. So you can see that cat allergy has a big impact on this human-cat bond, the human-animal bond. In around 5 to 20% of cases, allergy may be the reason for relinquishing a cat to a rehoming center, and it's often in the top 3 or 5 causes of relinquishment. 16% of previous cat owners cited allergy as a reason not to get another cat, and between 6 and 18% of people cited allergy as a reason not to consider getting a cat in the first place. So this does have a big impact. It should also be said, this is looking really at the tip of the iceberg. There will be many cases where people are allergic to cats where they don't actually eliminate cats from the household. They continue to live with the cat. In fact, surveys have suggested medical practitioners anticipate that only around about 30% of owners are likely to get rid of the cat when they advise it because they are allergic to the cat. Studies that have been done suggest actually the number is lower than that. These are 2 studies that I could find. One, only 22% of owners complied with the recommendation to get rid of the cat. The second study, only 4%. And again, this speaks of the quality of that human-animal bond. We don't want to give up the cat simply because we develop an allergy to the cat. But that will continue to cause problems. So we need to look at ways that we can minimize the impact of cat allergy in cases where humans continue to live alongside cats despite having a cat allergy. So thank you for listening, and I hope that's given you some useful insights.
Nous allons maintenant passer à la 3e partie. Merci. Et vous pouvez toujours poser vos questions dans l'encadré de la boîte chat. Hein.
One summer evening, almost a decade ago, our daughter returned from a play date with her friend. And very quickly, my wife and I noticed that she had swelling in the eyes, watery eyes, redness, as well as some rashes. After a few frantic phone calls, both to her friend's mom as well as the pediatrician, we quickly realized that she had spent the better part of the afternoon playing with a new cat that her friend had adopted, and that she is allergic to cat. This instance started us on a journey, decade-long journey, that led to a scientific breakthrough for managing cat allergens that I'll be talking about today. My name is Dr. Ebenezer Sathiraj. I'm an immunologist, and I'm currently Director of Molecular Nutrition at Nestle Purina Research in St. Louis, Missouri. I lead a team of brilliant scientists who focus on trying to understand the relationship between nutrition and health at the molecular level. I started my career in academia, finishing a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Chicago in Chicago, Illinois, then moved on to Northwestern University to be on their faculty before moving into industry, the pharmaceutical industry, where I conducted research in the area of inflammation and disease. I came to Nestle Purina Research in 2003 with the goal of setting up a nutritional immunology program. And part of the work that I'm going to be talking about really came from the work that was initiated during that period. In my talk today, I will be starting by answering a fundamental question, which is what causes human allergies to cats? Then I'll move on and give you a quick overview of this novel nutritional approach that we'll be talking about. Then I'll finish up by walking you through several scientific studies that shows both the safety and the efficacy of the approach. So let's begin by looking at the problem. Cat allergy is a major problem. It's one of the most common animal origin allergies in humans. The numbers based on countries vary quite a bit, but worldwide, on average, 1 in 5 adults, which is about 20% of the adult population in the world, have some level of sensitivities to cats. And as you look at the data, the level seems to be increasing over time. Cat allergies has significant consequences both for humans and cats. For cats, it limits the interaction between the allergic person and the cat, because people who have allergies tend to avoid interacting with the cat. Now, this can be extremely challenging for the cat as well, has consequences for the cat, because although we think cats tend to kind of live by themselves, they do crave for interaction with their owners. The other way that cats can be impacted is that one of the most common recommendations that you'll get from your allergist if you're allergic and have a cat in the household is, can you remove the cat from the home to be able to help you with the allergies? It's one of the most gut-wrenching decisions for anybody to take, but therefore it's one of the most commonly provided reason for relinquishment of the cat. And finally, of course, it's a significant barrier to cat ownership and adoption. Allergies to cat also have consequences for humans. Allergies typically cause fatigue, poor quality of sleep, reduced alertness, lower productivity and concentration. There are significant side effects of the medication that people take to be able to manage their symptoms. And above all, there is this emotional toll. You have a pet, you love the pet is part of your family, a member of your family, and you're not able to interact with them as closely as you'd like because of your allergies, and that can be a significant emotional challenge for most individuals. So in a nutshell, cat allergies have consequences both humans and cats, and have something that needs to be addressed. Let's move on to what is the primary protein or the allergen that causes cat allergies. Cats produce several allergens, but the most potent, the most common allergen that almost 95% of the cat allergic individuals respond to is to the protein FeLD1. FeLD1 is produced by all cats, regardless of breed, age, sex, weight, hair length, color, pattern, etc. there are no truly hypoallergenic cats. And this is an important point that I like to emphasize. If you look at the cat on the picture, which is a hairless Sphinx cat, even they produce some level of FeLV1. And this is an important point for all of us to keep in mind, because there is some mention about certain breed of cats to be very low allergenic. That is not true. What we know from the studies that we have conducted that is that even within a breed, cats produce different levels of FeLV1, and we'll see a little bit of that in the next few slides. FeLV1 is primarily produced by salivary and sebaceous glands. There is some production both in the anal glands as well, but the primary protein that gets transferred to the hair is believed to come from saliva as part of the grooming process that all cats indulge in. As saliva gets deposited on the hair, it forms dander, which then gets released into the environment. FeLV1 is easily airborne and remains airborne for a long number of time as small particles. FeLV1 also tends to be an extremely sticky protein, so it tends to stick on to clothing. In fact, a study that was conducted in Sweden noted that even kids who do not have a pet at home, a pet cat at home, get exposed to a significant amount of FeLV1 protein, because kids who have cats at home as pets tend to bring them into the school environment, attached to their books, to their clothing, to their clothes, etc. In fact, studies have shown that even homes or buildings that are brand new, newly constructed building where no pets have ever lived, you can detect significant amount of FeLV1 because it gets tracked from the people who come to work in these buildings, construction crew, etc., tracking FeLV1 through their hair in their jackets, in their coats, in their shoes, etc. So it is a very ubiquitous protein that's present all over the environment. And that is something to keep in mind also as we think about solutions to be able to address that. So as I described earlier, we did a study where we evaluated 60 cats over a period of a year, looking at their salivary FeLV1 levels. And we had several interesting findings that I would like to quickly walk you through. So what you're seeing here are two representative cats from the study. And what you can immediately see is that although these cats are not particularly known to be a low allergen breed, these are just domestic short hairs, you see that within that group of cats, there seem to be cats that have very low levels of FeLV1 and other cats that tend to have a very high level of FeLV1. The other interesting finding is that if you look at some cats, as you follow over the year, there are some cats that tend to have their FeLV1 levels vary quite significantly during that period, and others not as much. So for instance, if you look at this particular cat, she started with a low of 4.2, but a high of 322. So there's a huge range of FeLV1 levels that she had over the period of a year. Whereas if you look at this particular cat, the level was much more tighter, only between 0.1 and 1. But this is interesting. Is if you look at some of the experiences that I've heard talking to people, I shared these results with a veterinarian at a meeting in Europe, and this veterinarian colleague of mine and her husband, who happens to be allergic to cats, foster cats for over 20 years. And she mentioned that in the 20 years or so that they've been fostering cats, there are a few cats that her husband did not have any reaction to at all. In fact, 2 of those cats, they ended up adopting and keeping them as part of the household. And when she looked at this data, she said, this might perhaps explain why my husband doesn't react to these cats, because perhaps they have very low levels to begin with. And this is an interesting insight and perhaps relevant to some of the experiences that you might have had as part of your practice or talking to friends. The most important last point that I want to make about FeLV1 is the fact that the biological function for FeLV1 is unknown. Therefore, the potential health and welfare effects of stopping its production are also unknown. And as you'll talk as part of the study that we have done, this is a hallmark of the approach that we have taken, in that the approach that we are proposing does not stop the production, does not alter the production of FeLV1, does not destroy the faulty one. In fact, it retains the normal physiology of faulty one in the cats. Let's now move on and take a look at the current management strategies that people use to manage allergies. So what you see here is the path that the allergen takes from the cat to the environment, and then people who are allergic to cats tend to get exposed to the allergen and then start developing allergic symptoms. If you overlay that with the management strategies people currently use, it again falls into three buckets: strategies that revolve around the cat, strategies that revolve around the environment, and strategies that revolve around the allergic individual. The two strategies that is commonly recommended today that revolve around the cat is relinquishing, which is removing the cat from the household, or avoiding interactions. Both of these are difficult to implement, as we will see in the subsequent slides. The second approach is trying to manage the environment, and this really involves a lot of cleaning to be able to keep the allergen levels low. In some cases, it involves changing to hardwood floor, removing carpet and replacing it with hardwood floor, washing or changing upholstery very frequently, all with the intention of trying to remove the amount of allergen that gets accumulated in a home that has a cat. The third sets of strategies revolve around the allergic individuals and really fall into two categories. One, strategies that prevent symptoms once the person is exposed to the allergen, and this involves primarily immunotherapy, where you prevent developing symptoms when you're exposed to the allergen. And then once you develop allergies and start having symptoms, you manage these symptoms by using medication. Let's quickly walk us through the limitations of the approaches that I described. Let's begin with approaches that revolve around the allergic individual. The two that we talked about are immunotherapy and treating symptoms of allergy. Immunotherapy, as you all know, can be costly and can involve long-term treatment, sometimes years. And interestingly, immunotherapy is believed to work effectively for certain allergens. But if you look at data for efficacy for cat allergies, the data is very limited. Most studies suggest that the efficacy for cat allergies tend to be very limited. If you look at people addressing the allergen by managing the symptoms, either they take prescription drugs or over-the-counter medication, all these involve drugs that are antihistamines or decongestants. All these tend to have significant side effects and, of course, the cost involved. The other key thing to keep in mind is that both these approaches only benefit the individual who is taking them. People who undergo therapy will have benefit. If you have symptoms, you need to take medication. So in a household where you have multiple allergy sufferers, each of them has to go through this process to be able to get the benefit. Let's move on to the environmental controls. And this typically involved, as we described earlier, cleaning, but also filters that can minimize the amount of allergen that gets recirculated in the household. These factors do tend to work in terms of reducing the allergen in the household, but they involve significant amount of effort. They're costly, and it is very hard to have long-term compliance because you need to be able to do this day in and day out as part of a regimen to be able to effectively manage allergen in the household. Then we go to approaches that revolve around the cat. And the two approaches that I talked about was one, removing the cat from the household, and the other one was avoiding interaction with the cat. Both these are extremely challenging for cat owners to involve in. If you talk to allergists, one of the most common recommendations they would give to their patients who has allergies to cat is to remove the cat from the household. And this is extremely gut-wrenching because the reason you adopt a pet is because you love pets. They're part of your family, and it is very hard to be able to give somebody away. In fact, talking to some of the allergists, one in particular who's a pediatric allergist, and her comment was, every time I have a mom or a dad bringing their child to me for evaluation, and I realize that following an investigation that he or she has allergies to cat, and I suggest, can you give your cat away? The immediate reaction that I get is, how can I do that? Because that cat is my child's best friend, pet, it is going to be heart-wrenching for us to be able to give the cat away because it'll have a significant negative impact on our child. And in most cases, I'm pretty certain that this particular individual will never come to me. They will go and visit another allergist to get a second opinion. In fact, if you look at statistics, over 84% of people who have allergies to cat and have a cat in the household will refuse to give the cat away, but look for other solutions because it is a difficult decision for people to make. And of these, 20% would be more comfortable changing the allergist to get a different opinion rather than going with the recommendation that he or she would make. So that again talks about the bond that we have with our pets. And that is something important to keep in mind as we look at the overall impact of this problem. The other approach that some people have recommended is to bait the cat. Technically, baiting the cat removes the allergen from the hair and therefore is likely to reduce the amount of allergen that this cat is going to release into the environment. But baiting a cat is challenging. As you all know, cats are not dogs. Therefore, this is an approach that is not typically recommended. Let's now look at the approach that we will be talking about, and it's important to be able to really understand the journey of FELD1 as we get prepared to understand this novel approach and describe this novel approach. So what we saw so far is that FELD1 gets secreted in the saliva. It then gets distributed through the hair during the grooming process and eventually enters the environment as shed hair and dander. We saw it stays up in the environment and gets released into the environment and gets sticking onto carpets, upholstery, clothing, and that's how it gets disseminated within the environment. What happens when somebody who's allergic encounters the FELD1 is that it goes and binds to receptors that are present on the mast cell. These receptors are called as IgE molecules. So if a person is allergic to cat, they tend to have IgE molecules that are directed against FELD1. These IgE molecules are bind to mast cells that are distributed throughout the body. When FELD1 molecule binds to these receptors on mast cell, it triggers a degranulation event that leads to the release of factors that results in the development of allergic symptoms. A great example of a factor like that is histamine. That's why when you have allergies, you take antihistaminic drugs. The other important idea that I want to kind of give you a quick overview and an understanding of is this concept of allergen load. Both these are important to understand the novel approach that we're talking about. Now, what you're seeing here is this red line kind of graphically describes a threshold above which, if the total amount of allergen goes above that, you start having allergic symptoms. If the allergen load remains below that, you do not have allergic symptoms for this particular individual. So let's start by building in the allergens that are commonly present in the environment. And as you all know, most people tend to have allergies to more than one particular allergen. So let's look at allergen layer. This is apparently present throughout the year in the household, spring, summer, fall, winter, etc. If you build in, you have allergen B, same situation present throughout the year. Allergen C, which is also present throughout the year. And if you combine the total allergen load, including allergen C, it is still below the threshold of the allergen. So you are not likely to have symptoms. This individual is not likely to have symptom at this stage. If you build in additional allergen that goes on top of C, which is D, you can see at some points in the time your threshold goes above and you start developing allergic symptoms. Now, if you assume that, let's take for the example, as an example, if C is FELD1, if you're able to reduce the amount of allergen in the environment by how much allergen the cats are depositing into the environment, you're likely to keep the allergen load below this threshold for most of the year, and therefore likely to have a benefit. Now, again, I'm trying to explain this as a concept. This is very unique to each individual, the level of sensitivity, the different allergens that they're responding to. But the concept that I want to share with you here is that you want to be able to keep the allergen below a certain threshold to be able to have no or reduced symptoms. And the approach that we're taking is to be able to have a diet that I'll talk about that actually tries to do exactly that. So before we go on to the next part of my talk, where I'm going to give you a quick overview of this novel approach, let me recap the key things that we learned in the first part of my talk. FeLD1 is the key allergen that most people respond to. It's a protein that is produced in the saliva as well as sebaceous secretion, gets released into the environment through the grooming process, where FeLD1 is deposited onto the hair, dries, forms dander, and gets into the environment. An allergic individual has IgE molecules that are specific for FeLD1 that are bound to mast cells. And when FeLD1 comes in contact with this particular receptor, there is a degranulation event that leads to the release of factors that cause the allergy. If we block the interaction and prevent the degranulation event, you're likely to have a benefit of not having those factors released. The final concept that we walked through was this idea of allergen load, where you want to be, the goal is to be able to keep the allergen level below a certain threshold for somebody not to have symptoms. And this is something that is also very unique for that person, for the environment they live in. But as a concept, the idea is to be able to reduce the allergen load in the environment. With that, let's quickly go into a quick description of what this novel approach for managing FeLD1 is. So the goal of the approach for us was not to stop or alter the production of FeLD1, because as we discussed earlier, its function is not clearly known for the cat, and therefore you do not want to interfere with this production or suppress its production. But to be able to look at an alternative way of trying to keep the levels of allergen in the household below a threshold where symptoms are less likely to happen. And we use an antibody technology, IgY egg antibody technology, to be able to achieve that, and I'll quickly walk you through that. This is a technology that's been proven to be safe and effective for decades. So a couple of words about what is IgY technology. IgY is the avian equivalent of mammalian immunoglobulin. And egg-based IgY ingredients have been used for decades in the livestock industry, and now getting a lot of interest from the human dietary supplements. So it's a safe ingredient that's been used quite extensively in the food space. And this is the technology that we'll be using to try to reduce the amount of allergen that gets into the environment from the cat. So let's look at this video that talks about that describes our idea of using antibodies, egg antibodies directed against FeLD1 from binding and neutralizing FeLD1. So if you look at the video here, what you see here are, these are two IgY antibodies that is specific for FeLD1 that tends to bind FeLD1, which is the protein that you see in the center. Let's look at that. That's your FeLD1 protein. These are IgY antibodies. So they are blocked and they have neutralized it. And this is what happens when a neutralized FeLD1 tries to bind to the IgE molecules that's present on mast cell. And what you're seeing here are the two IgE molecules that are depicted. This will be present on a mast cell. You can imagine a cell out there. Under normal circumstances, when the FeLD1 protein comes in contact with these, it will bind these epitopes, these green surfaces that is marked, lead to what's called as a cross-linking event, and that is what triggers the release of factors that causes symptoms of allergy. Look what happens when a neutralized FeLD1, in other words, a FeLD1 that's been bound by anti-FeLD1 antibodies derived from egg, tries to approach these two receptors. As you can see, the normal process of binding here is disrupted. It is no longer capable of binding to those receptors and therefore incapable of eliciting a degranulation event, causing the release of factors that would cause symptoms of allergy. So that's the fundamental concept with which we started this work. If you put all that together in kind of a whole process flow, it starts by feeding cats a diet that's coated with egg ingredient containing anti-FeLD1 IgY antibodies. As the cats eat, this antibody gets released into the saliva, and it binds to the FeLD1 that is released into the saliva in the cat. and these antibodies neutralize the FeLD1. This neutralized FeLD1 is then transferred to the hair during the normal grooming process. And then when neutralized FeLD1 comes in contact with, it's unable to activate the key steps that is required to do a degranulation event. It's no longer recognized as an allergen when it's released into the environment. So that's the fundamental idea with which we started this work. I'm going to move on to the last part of my talk, where I'll walk you through several key studies that were done to be able to establish both the safety and the efficacy of the approaches. The studies that I'll be talking about fall into two categories: in vitro and ex vivo studies. These were studies that were conducted in the laboratory, and in vivo studies that were conducted in cats. In the in vitro and ex vivo studies, the primary goal of that whole series of work was to really establish that our hypothesis, which was an antibody neutralizing FeLD1, prevents FeLD1 from binding and activating a mast cell. We wanted to really prove that hypothesis with laboratory experiments. After having done that, we moved on to do studies with cats, where first we wanted to establish the safety of this approach for the cat. Then we did two studies where we were able to clearly demonstrate that feeding cats a diet containing anti-FeLD1 IgY clearly reduces the amount of active FeLD1 that's present in their saliva and on their hair. So let's begin with the first data slide. This is one of the various experiments that were conducted. The first set of experiments that I'm not going to be showing today clearly showed that you can physically prevent FeLD1 protein from binding human IgE molecules if it's neutralized with an anti-FeLD1 IgY antibody. What you're seeing here is that preventing that interaction has clear biological consequences. So let me quickly walk you through what we have here. What you're looking at is an experiment that actually measures the ability of FeLD1 and initiating a degranulation event, and our ability to show that if you neutralize the FeLD1, you're able to significantly reduce this degranulation event, which is the key hypothesis with which we started this idea. What you're seeing on the y-axis is the degranulation event that is depicted in these blue bars, and it's set at 100%. What you're seeing here is mast cells are binding to FeLD1, which is not neutralized, and you're clearly able to establish that there is significant amount of degranulation. You set that at 100%. Then you see what happens when you now challenge the mast cell with the FeLD1 protein that is neutralized. What you can clearly see is that you're able to prevent or reduce the degranulation process by as much as 60% when you're now challenging the mast cell with a FeLD1 molecule that is neutralized with anti-FeLD1 IgY. What you're seeing here are control experiments where if you use IgY that is not specific with FeLD1, you do not have any impact on reduction of degranulation event. So what this data, these sets of experiments clearly showed that the hypothesis which we started has significant merit in that if you prevent FeLD1 from binding to human IgE by neutralizing it using an anti-IgY antibody, you're clearly able to prevent the degranulation event that is required for the symptoms of allergies to happen. Having established that, we then moved on to do studies with cats. And the first study that we wanted to establish was the approach is safe for cats. And this is paramount in all the studies that we do as Purina, where we put the safety of the cat at the heart of all the work we do. As you all know, we are pet owners, we love cats and dogs, and we want to be sure that anything that we do above all has no negative impact for that. So this was a very crucial study for us to complete before we started the other studies where we could show the efficacy of the approach. Briefly, this was a 6-month study with 40 cats. Along with the control group, there were 3 other groups of cats that were fed levels that were many times higher than the levels of egg antibodies that were used in the efficacy studies. And during the 6-month period, we had a whole series of veterinary evaluations that were done. This included clinical evaluation. We evaluated body weight, food consumption, ophthalmic evaluation, blood chemistry, blood count, CBC, coagulation, urine analysis. There was also some behavior analysis done to see if there's any impact on the behavior of the cat. When we looked at the data after the 6 months of feeding, what we clearly demonstrated and noticed that there was no clinical difference between the control levels, where no anti-FeLV1 antibody were present, or any of the levels tested, clearly showing that this approach is perfectly safe for cats. This was work that was published late last year in the journal Frontiers in Veterinary Science. So having established the safety of the approach for the cat, we went on to do our first study where we asked the question, does the approach reduce the amount of active FeLV1 in the saliva of the cat? For this study, we selected cats that had moderate or higher levels of FeLV1 expression so that we can measure FeLV1 reduction in these cats. There are some cats, as we saw earlier, that have very low levels to begin with. And if you include them in a study, if those levels are slightly above or below the level of detection of the ELISA, you really cannot show a decrease. So therefore, those cats are eliminated from the study. Saliva samples are collected 5 hours after the morning feeding, and the amount of active FeLV1 was measured using an ELISA kit, and this was evaluated as weekly averages. Now, let me tell you a little bit about what I mean by active FeLV1. The ELISA kit uses the same approach where the FeLV1 antibody has to bind to the capture antibody in the kit to be able to detect. A neutralized FeLV1, which is unable to bind to human IgE, is also not able to bind to the captured antibody in the ELISA assay. And therefore, the ELISA assay can only detect free FeLV1. In other words, neutralized FeLV1 cannot be detected. And therefore, what I'm referring to active FeLV1 is FeLV1 that is still remaining in the saliva of the cat that is not bound by anti-FeLV1 IgY and therefore not utilized. When we looked at the data from the study, each cat served as its own control. And here are results from the study. What you're seeing here is weeks on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, you're looking at mean change from baseline from the statistical model that was used to evaluate the data. And what you can see is that while you do see a decline in the control group, there was a statistically significantly greater decline seen in the test group starting from week 3. In fact, you got a 24% reduction of active FeLV1 in the saliva of these cats starting from week 3 onwards. This was work that was published also last year in the Journal of Feline Medicine and Surgery. Having established the fact that the approach that we started with can clearly reduce the amount of active FeLV1 in the saliva of the cat, we went on to ask the question, what happens to the amount of active FeLV1 in the hair of the cats? So here's a summary of the findings from the study. So the first proof of concept study clearly showed that feeding a dry cat food coated with anti-FeLV1 IgY significantly reduced active FeLV1 in the saliva of the cat, starting with the 3rd week of feeding. Having done this, we went on to ask the question, what happens to the amount to the hair FeLV1 levels? And for this, we designed the study to be able to ask the exact same question, which is, can a diet containing anti-FeLV1 antibody reduce the amount of active FeLV1 in the hair of this cat? This was a much larger study where we had 105 cats that were fed a control diet for 2 weeks, followed by a test diet for 10 weeks. Hair was collected by brushing the front, shoulder, and sides of this cat. Active FeLV1 was measured using the same ELISA assay that I described earlier and was evaluated as weekly averages, and each cat served as its own control. Here are the results from the study. What you're seeing on the y-axis is the weeks baseline and week 1 to week 10. On the y-axis, you're looking at the absolute FeLV1 levels in these cats here. And what you can clearly see is that, again, there is a decline starting from week 1 and week 2, but starting week 3, you start seeing a dramatic decrease in the amount of active FeLV1 that can be detected in the hair of this cat, and that lasts almost until the end of the study. This work was also published earlier last year in the journal Immunity, Inflammation, and Disease. If you look at the data overall, 97% of the cats showed reduction of FeLD1 levels as compared to the baseline. 86% of the cats showed a reduction of 30% or greater, and 50% of the cats showed a reduction of 50% or greater. And let me put that in context for you. What this shows us that the approach of feeding a diet containing anti-FeLD1 antibodies is clearly able to reduce the amount of active FeLD1 in the hair by as much as 50% based on the data that we have from the study. And that is kind of denoted here. If you look at the average reduction over the period from week 3 to week 10, there was an average reduction of about 40%, clearly showing that you're able to reduce the amount of active FeLD1 by almost 50% once these cats get onto the diet containing anti-FeLD1 antibodies. Let's go back to what we started here, because both these studies clearly shows that the approach of trying to use an anti-FeLD1 antibody as part of the diet is able to reduce the amount of active FeLD1 both in the saliva and in the hair. And as you saw in the last slide, there's a dramatic reduction of the amount of active FeLD1 that is detected in the hair. And if you connect that with the earlier idea of trying to reduce the amount of allergen in the environment below a threshold, this is clearly has the potential to be able to deliver that. So if you go back to the slide that we started, where we were looking at the current management of cat allergies, approaches revolving around the cat, approaches revolving around the environment, and then approaches around the allergic individual. What we're proposing is another approach that can be added to this overall strategy to be able to reduce the allergen level that eventually gets into the environment. What's unique about the approach, as we saw in the studies that I described, is that not only is it safe and effective, but it's also very simple to use. Because if you look at the earliest approaches, relinquishment avoidance challenging for an individual to adopt. Cleaning extremely tedious, hard to be able to keep maintaining. And of course, approaches that involve the allergic individual, you have to have significant investment in time and effort to be able to get those benefits. The approach that we are proposing is simple in the sense that you have to just feed the diet. You don't have to do anything else. And the active ingredient in the diet is able to deliver the benefit of reducing the amount of active FeLD1. So not only is it safe and effective, but it's also extremely simple because you don't need to change any other routine that you need to do as part of the approach to manage the allergens in the environment. So the scientific breakthrough that I'm so excited to share with you and walk you through these slides is really a part of a comprehensive allergy management plan. And we believe this approach can reduce cat allergens while importantly keeping the cat in its loving home, which I know is extremely important for people like me as well as others who love their pets. So let's quickly summarize the key points that we discussed during this presentation. So the innovation delivers specific anti-FeLD1 antibodies, also called as IgY, in an egg product ingredient that is coated onto the cat's kibble. The anti-FeLD1 IgY is safe, and it effectively neutralizes active FeLD1 in the mouth of the cat as the cat chews the food. As cat grooms, the neutralized FeLD1 is transferred to the cat's hair. Neutralized FeLD1 is no longer recognizable as an allergen when released into the environment. And most fundamental to this approach is that the normal FeLD1 production is maintained and cats' overall physiology is not impacted. Thank you very much for your attention.
Merci beaucoup. On répondra aux questions à la fin des présentations. Pour l'instant, vous pouvez toujours continuer à les poser dans la boîte chat. Maintenant, nous allons passer à la dernière partie, à la présentation de Liveclear par le Dr Medved Claudia Fischer.
Ok, suite à la présentation du Dr Ebenezer Satiraj, j'ai le plaisir de vous présenter le résultat de plus d'une décennie de recherche, la gamme de produits ProPlan Liveclear. ProPlan Liveclear est un nouvel aliment révolutionnaire pour les chats. Le premier et le seul aliment qui réduit les allergènes sur les poils et les squames du chat. Le concept est fondé sur les résultats de toutes nos recherches qui viennent d'être présentées. Pour résumer, nous savons que tous les chats produisent allergènes FeLD1, quelle que soit leur race, leur âge, la longueur ou la couleur de leur poil, leur sexe ou leur poids. L'ingrédient clé de ProPlan Liveclear est une protéine spécifique issue de l'œuf. Lorsque les chats mangent cet aliment, la protéine neutralise FeLD1 dans la bouche du chat. En réduisant le FeLD1 actif dans la salive du chat, cela réduit l'allergène qui est transféré sur les poils lors de la toilette du chat et à terme réduit l'allergène dans l'environnement. Lorsqu'il est donné quotidiennement, ProPlan Liveclear réduit considérablement les allergènes sur le poil des chats dès la 3e semaine d'alimentation. La gamme ProPlan Liveclear couvre chaque étape de vie du chaton au chat adulte et senior. Elle sera disponible en Suisse à partir d'avril. Les recommandations habituelles d'utilisation s'appliquent également à ProPlan Liveclear. Il est important de répartir la ration journalière sur plusieurs repas au cours de la journée. Et comme tout changement de régime alimentaire, il est recommandé à vos clients d'effectuer une transition en douceur. Spécifiquement à ProPlan Liveclear, pour obtenir une efficacité optimale, il doit être donné quotidiennement, doit être la source d'alimentation principale du chat et doit être conservé dans un endroit frais et sec. ProPlan Liveclear n'a pas pour vocation de remplacer d'autres stratégies de réduction des allergènes, mais ajoute une autre dimension qui peut aider à réduire la charge des allergènes dans les foyers possédant un chat. Grâce à cette approche révolutionnaire de la gestion des allergènes du chat, la qualité de vie des chats et des familles qui les aiment pourrait être enrichie par un contact plus proche que jamais. Merci.
Merci beaucoup pour les présentations. On va passer aux questions. Il y avait déjà une première question au tout début à l'attention du docteur Peter Schmidt-Grendelmeyer. Dans quelle proportion le FLD1 diminue-t-il avec la castration? Le docteur Grendelmeyer avait déjà répondu dans le chat environ 40% de réduction. Je ne sais pas si vous voudrez ajouter quelque chose à cela.
Ici, c'est Peter Schmidt. C'est très variable, c'est clair, cet effet, mais bon, c'est des études qui montrent ça. Mais comme on a vu maintenant, il y a beaucoup de variations dans le canton de FLD1.
Merci. Et il y avait des questions aussi au docteur Satiraj. Je vais les traduire. Et so for Dr. Satiraj, there are a couple questions. Do we know why different cats have different levels of FeLD1 production?
The answer is no, and that's really an interesting question. We have tried to do, research in published literature, and there has been no relationship as to what really dictates the level of FeLD1. We know certain facts, for example, as cats tend to age, their levels generally decline, not dramatically, but generally. But beyond that, it is really, there's no information showing what explains why some cats have different levels of FeLD1.
Thank you. Another question was, what was the frequency of the meals offered to the cats in the study where the amount of active FeLD1 on cat hair was measured? How many times a day were they offered the food?
So in all the studies that were described that I walked you through, they were offered one meal in the morning, and that stayed until next day. And then whatever was remaining was taken away, and then we had a new feeding of new meal offered the next day. So it is once a day.
Once a day, and they would just eat during
Correct.
the day. Okay.
Yes.
And another question, has it been shown that there is indeed an effect for people living with a cat fed in this way with this innovation, and how effective it is?
That's an important question, and again, it's a challenging one because it is very hard to be able to do those kinds of control studies in a in-home situation. Our focus mainly has been trying to demonstrate the efficacy of the approach in reducing or neutralizing the allergen that gets into the environment. There were a collaborative study that was done with Dr. James Wedner at Washington University in St. Louis. More information about that is available on the Purina website, and that study was in a control setting. They were able to demonstrate reduction in some of the symptoms that people experience, but those were done by these clinical colleagues of ours, and that's available on the Purina website for you to take a look at.
Thank you. Est-ce que vous avez besoin de traduction pour les réponses ou est-ce qu'en anglais ça va? Vous pouvez écrire dans la boîte si jamais. Okay. So there were more questions. Well, you answered the question about the studies and how often we have to feed the cat. Does this feed also works with cats that tend to not chew their food and swallow it whole?
In the studies that we have done, generally, we have done, as I told you, 3 studies that we talked about. We've also done, other people have fed it over the period since the product has been in the market. We do not have any data suggesting any correlation between how these cats eat their dry food. So I don't have any information to specifically address that question, except that in all the studies that we conducted, as I described it, we are able to see significant reduction in the level of FeLD1.
Okay, and there's a question again. However, how often do we have to feed a cat per day to achieve the effects? It's a bit similar to the other question, but is there a minimum quantity they have to eat per day?
I think the whole diet has been formulated on how much you will be feeding the cat, and we have tried to cover the range in these studies, trying to have enough active ingredient in the diet to be able to feed a whole range of cats with different feeding behavior. In terms of specific feeding instructions, I think Claudia may be able to give you, Dr. Visha may be able to give you more information on that. But in all the studies that we have done, we have had cats that have very different feeding behavior, older cats, younger cats, some eat little, some eat more. Overall, you're able to see a dramatic reduction or neutralization in the amount of active FeLD1 in all these studies.
Yeah,
Great, thank you very much.
Maybe I can just build on what Dr. Satiraj has just said. But yes, all the formulations have been formulated that when they're fed, following the feeding guidelines, that they're really delivering sufficient amount of the anti-FeLD1 to provide the efficacy that we've demonstrated.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to check if there are any more questions in the box. Just 1 second. So another question. In relation to the question of Julien Ducomin, let me just scroll back up. If there are clinical studies on the efficiency of the product, do you have already studies in cat allergic patients? Would be easy to recruit patients, I guess.
We have not done any studies with patients ourselves, no.
Thank you. Any more questions?
But I guess, sorry to jump in, I guess this question was coming from Professor Peter Schmidt. Probably we can pick up on this question later and check if we are willing to promote some kind of not testing, but test the product with the cats of those patients that have cat allergies.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, I step in. That's true. This question came from my side. Of course, that's what finally will count, that the patients suffer less. I guess it will work, but will be a very interesting but also challenging study.
Absolutely. And that is, I think, one of the challenges that we had, because most of these allergy studies tend to be extremely complicated given the multiple factors that affects the level of allergen in the household, for example. But that'll be good conversation to have down the road. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. But very interesting. Really exciting approach.
Thank you very much.
And maybe what I can add to the point with regards to the efficacy in those people who suffer from cat allergies is since we have launched the product in some other countries in the course of 2020, we really do have overwhelmingly positive testimonials and feedback from pet owners who have been using the product, and it's really across all those countries where the product is available. So it is testimony that the product is definitely having an effect. As Dr. Satiraj pointed out, there's a lot of different factors that affect cat allergies with the allergenic threshold, etc. So of course the impact for each individual is different, but it has been overwhelmingly positive feedback.
Great, thank you. And there's another question. What happens in summer when the temperature are high, elevated? Is the efficiency still as good?
So that's a question with regard to the stability of the ingredient, the antibody in the diet. The studies that we have conducted as part of the commercial launch as well as product development, we have taken that into consideration. So generally speaking, if you're keeping your diet in a home, not exposed to extreme temperatures, like just leaving it outside in a hot country, you're unlikely to have any impact whatsoever. The diet is going to be just as effective as you would use it, for example, in the winter season. So in a home environment, with all the changes that you'd expect during the summer versus winter, it has no impact in terms of the efficacy. And we have done those studies to be able to ensure that as part of the commercial launch.
Great. I hope this answers the question. Est-ce que ça répond à vos questions? Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions? Je vais regarder, mais je crois qu'on a fait le tour. OK. Donc, nous vous rappelons déjà que le webinaire a été enregistré. Donc, si jamais vous souhaitez le revisualiser, on vous fera parvenir un lien dès qu'il sera en ligne pour pouvoir le regarder de nouveau s'il y a des passages que vous souhaitez revoir. Merci encore à nos speakers. Thank you again, Dr. Peter Schmitz-Krendelmeyer, Dr. Andy Sparks, Dr. Ebenezer Satyaraj, Dr. Claudia Vischer. Thank you very much for your presentation this evening.
Thank you.
Merci à vous aussi d'avoir participé et assisté à ce webinaire. Nous restons à votre disposition s'il y a toujours des questions par email et nous vous donnerons les liens pour revisualiser ce webinaire plus tard. S'il n'y a pas d'autres questions, je vais clôturer le webinaire et je vous souhaite une bonne soirée. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, au revoir.
Merci, au revoir.